Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our online worship at Christ Lutheran Vail Church. I'm Pastor Hook, and this is Josh. You are watching an online version of our worship service this morning, and we're happy to share this time with you today.
Now, don't forget to follow our Facebook page, Christ Lutheran Vail Church, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Both have tons of great content to help you with your walk with God. You can also follow us on Instagram at CLV Church for another way to stay connected during the week.
Now, if you're new to us, we'd love to connect with you better. If you'd like, text the word welcome to our church phone number displaying on the screen right now, and we'll send you a few texts to tell you about our church, and hopefully we will learn more about how we can serve you.
Pastor, one of the central teachings of Jesus is his Sermon on the Mount. He clarified the teachings of the Old Testament and set the church on a course of love.
That's right, Josh. I think the Sermon on the Mount is probably the most important teaching of Jesus. And we'll look at one of those teachings today. And my prayer is that we will learn Jesus' heart. But before we start, why don't you just take a minute to say hi or connect in the comments, and we'll get ready to praise God.
When the music fades, all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing just to bring something that's of worth, that will bless your heart. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within, through the way things appear. You're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the things I've made it, when full, where your streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name.
Today we gather to learn at the feet of Jesus. At Christ Lutheran Vail, we celebrate everyone who learns from the stories of Jesus and applies them to their lives. If you have given to CLV, you are our partner in forwarding our mission, making loving disciples. Through programs like the Helping Hands Fund, where we provide food and short-term assistance to those who have emergency needs, we show the love of Jesus by letting Him use our hands and our feet to serve our community. Our goal is to show our neighbors, our loved ones, and our friends Christ's deep and unending love in this world. Whether you have given before or you would like to do so for the first time, you can invest in our mission by going to ChristLutheranVail.org and clicking on I Want to Give at the top right of the page. You'll have a chance right now to do that if you would like. We thank God for all these gifts to bring Christ's light and love to our community. And now, Pastor Hook has a message for us. He is going to share a message from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount.
2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, perhaps it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay. In leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I'm sure you've heard this story before. It's a famous poem by Robert Frost. It's quoted in many places. He's coming upon a fork in the road, and he looks down one fork and says, should I go that way? Or he looks down the other fork and he says, or maybe I should go that way. And he says, well, maybe I could come back and take each road someday in the future. And he realizes, no, as roads go, you got to choose one. You got to let go of the other. And so he takes one road. And the road that he took has made all the difference. People will ask me, and I'm sure you've been asked this before too, if you could go 100 years in the past or 100 years in the future, and you could only do which one, which path would you take? And of course, I'm a man of science and technology, and I usually almost always pick, I would like to go in the future and see that. I think there was even a Facebook post on our Facebook page at Christ Lutheran Vail this week about would you go in the past or would you go in the future? And it's usually about equally divided, right? Some people would like to go in the past, some people in the future. I almost always pick the future, but there's this one thing that would make me want to go in the past. And it's the golden age of poetry, right? Where paper was expensive and writing was difficult, and people would stop and really think about what they were writing the first time that they wrote it. It was a time that was simpler, I think, and people could actually spend more time thinking about poetry. There wasn't YouTube and Facebook and all these other things that diverted our time. People actually just sat and pondered great thoughts for a long time. And this is one of those great thoughts that people have pondered for a long time about what's the meaning of this poem, and why did Robert Frost write it, and what is the deeper meaning for ourselves. I mean, ask yourself, which road do you take? The well-traveled road or the not-so-traveled road? Which roads have you taken in the past? Have you tried to take the well-traveled or the less-traveled road in the past? And why did you take them? And what difference has taking those roads made in your life? And here's, of course, a great question that we should all consider, and it's this: which road would Jesus have us take? We're nearing the end of our sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount. We've spent a lot of time on it. And now as we're wrapping things up, Jesus is helping us to think about the roads that we take in life. And he's calling us to think about the words that he's just taught and what those words mean. And perhaps more importantly, what are we going to do about it? Now, today's text is not very long. We're going to just read it, and then we're going to spend the rest of our time thinking about what these words mean. The text is from Matthew chapter 7, and it's just simply verses 13 and 14. This is what Jesus says. He says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Narrow is the gate that leads to life, and few find it. Jesus says there's two gates. One's narrow and one's big. And the big gate, well, everybody typically enters through the big gate, right? But the narrow gate, there's not so many people that come through the narrow gate. Few people find that gate. Whenever I'm preaching on such a text, I try to go back and realize what it must have been like at the time of Jesus. Were there times where there were gates, big gates and narrow gates? And of course, we know that coming into the city, typically there was a main entrance to the city, a big, wide entrance into the city. And that's where the vast majority of people entered through that entrance. At this entrance, you would typically have people selling stuff at the entrance to the gate to the city. And if it made sense, oftentimes there was a tax collector that would be there at that big entrance to the city. It's like what everybody did was entered through that big gate. But sometimes there would be a narrow gate. It'd be a narrow gate on purpose. Not as many people could move through that narrow gate. They certainly couldn't bring goods and commerce through that narrow gate. It was just a narrow gate. And sometimes they could get in without a taxation. But oftentimes they couldn't. And so the vast majority of people would enter through the big gate. And when Jesus talks about this, people know what this means, right? They can picture in their head a narrow gate, and they can picture in their head a wide gate. And so the question that we always ask whenever we hear teachings like this from Jesus is, what is the purpose of this teaching? What is it? What's the lesson that you want us to learn? And of course, the first lesson I think that everybody goes to is, well, enter through the narrow gate. Jesus is almost telling us to enter through the narrow gate. Don't go with the flow. In life, there's kind of two ways. There's the easy way and there's the hard way. And the easy way may look like the easy way because everybody else is doing it. But what Jesus is telling us to do is to stop and to pause and consider that maybe we shouldn't take the easy way. Maybe we should take the hard way. Now, what's interesting is that in the early church, the followers of Jesus were often called the way. It was called the Hadas, the Hadas. That's the Greek word for the way. And in the early teachings of the church, they really did teach there was two ways. There was the way of life, is what they called it. And the way of life was peaceable and love and forgiveness and grace and all the things that we think about in the church today. All of those things led to the way of life. And then there was a way of death. And the way of death was not peaceable. The way of death was self-focused and anger and bitterness and envy and strife and all the things that lead to more anger and those types of things in the world. And Jesus taught, as he teaches in the Beatitudes, and the early church taught, as they did in the early church, that you really should, as a Christian, you should take the way of life. And the way of life isn't necessarily always the easy way, but it is the way of life. I remember, not too long ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I was decided that I was going to go up Pistol Hill. I don't know if you've ever been up Pistol Hill, but there's a mountaintop that's not too far from the church. It's called Pistol Hill. And there's a path that goes up to the very top. And if you can follow the path and the cairns that are laid out on the path, you can take this path all the way up to the top. And when you do, you get this beautiful view of Vail. And I remember one time I was trying to take this path to the top, and I'd done it a few times, so I kind of knew where the cairns were that laid out the way to the top. And there's this one little passage that you go to where you have to step up on these stones and grab onto a tree to kind of really get yourself up. And I got to that point, and I don't know what time of year it was. It must have been right after the monsoons or something, but there were bees that were on that path. And I look at that path and I'm like, if I go on this path, I'm going to go right through a swarm of bees. And so I was looking for a different path to go up. And I kind of went off the trail and kind of found myself out in the middle of nowhere trying to go on this path that hadn't been trodden before. And I remember thinking to myself, maybe I should have fought the bees rather than go on this path. I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. I mean, he's talking about kind of, a narrow door and a wide door. And I would say most people would probably go through the wide door. It seems like it's wider. It seems like it's easier. There's more people on that. If you're getting hurt, that's where the people are. There are narrow paths, but they're not going to kill you. They're just narrow paths. And this is the one that Jesus says. You've got to take or consider taking the narrow path. Because the wide path looks great, but it's not necessarily the path that I want you to take. One of my favorite movies is Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And if you know the story about Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, it's about a young boy and a girl. And they live in a town where there's no young boys and girls allowed. And so they always have to try to hide from the police because the police are always trying to capture the young boys and girls. And there's this one slimy character, and he puts up a jail, but over the jail he puts this fake disguise of a candy treat truck. And the guy opens up the thing and he says, "Trinkle Tots and all free today." And the young boy and the girl see Trinkle Tarts, and they go to this thing and they go to get their Trinkle Tart, but it ends up being a prison, and the whole rest of the movie is trying to get them out of prison. And of course, as young boys and girls, we know, right, that just because candy looks good doesn't mean that it's always good for us. I mean, I think the fifth graders this last month were reading the Chronicles of Narnia, and Peter gets into trouble because he sells out his brothers and sisters for Turkish delight. And we love these stories because we know that it's a truism that just because something looks good doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for you. The grass isn't always greener on the other side. So as you live out your life, don't take the easy way out, right? I mean, struggle. Sometimes take the hard way. Yes, it's a hard way, but in the end, it actually ends up being the easy way. Our parents told us this, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. Or maybe your mom and dad said, well, if all of your friends were jumping off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff too? And you say, well, no, of course, that would be stupid. Because we don't do stupid things, even if they look appealing. We know this. How many times do you have to touch a hot stove before you realize that you shouldn't touch a hot stove? We know these things because people tell us. We shouldn't always take the easy path. We shouldn't take the well-worn path. Sometimes you have to take the difficult path. But in taking the difficult path, we grow. We learn something. And then that helps shape us as we move forward. And see, that this is the lesson from this story, right? Which is, don't always take the path that everybody else is taking. Take the path that Jesus wants you to take. And yes, sometimes that path is difficult. But Jesus wants you to grow in your faith and to become more of a solid individual in Him so that you can be His hands and feet. So sometimes take the difficult path. Take the road less traveled. Take the road that is narrow. I mean, that's a great interpretation of this saying of Jesus, and I think it's true. But But I don't think it's always true. I don't think that's the only interpretation of this thing, because there are times when Jesus allows us to take the wrong path, right? Just take a look at the story of the prodigal son. The prodigal son comes to his father and says, "Father, I want my inheritance." And then the father gives him the inheritance. And what does this young son do? He goes and he takes the wrong path, right? He goes to the next village and he spends it all until he's living in poverty and pigsty. And the older brother, well, he took the right path. He never took the right path. And yet, Jesus allowed, or the father allowed, the younger son to take the wrong path. Sometimes Jesus allows us in our life. He allows us to take the path that looks appealing, and it isn't until we actually take that path that we realize that this is a path that leads to death. And that's what's so difficult about this interpretation. It's easy to say, okay, there's the easy path and there's the hard path, and Jesus wants you to take the hard path. But if you always take if you do take the easy path, sometimes you don't grow in your faith. And so sometimes Jesus wants you to take the hard path. And yet, those hard paths are, well, they're hard. And we learn from them and we grow from them. And so sometimes we need to not necessarily seek out the hard path, but understand that sometimes the hard paths are hard and they're difficult, but we grow from them. And that's a good thing. There's a kind of a thing that clinical psychologists know, and that is, a lot of people take drugs because the path that they're on is too difficult, and they don't, instead of dealing with the difficulty, they kind of medicate themselves away from the difficulty. And so if you get addicted to alcohol, at some point you're using alcohol as a way to navigate life, as opposed to simply going through it and letting God help you through it. And that's what clinical psychologists will tell you, why most people become addicted to all these addictions that we have, is because the people don't want to face reality. And yet we need to face reality, because in facing reality, that's where the strength of courage and inner character and all those things come from, in facing reality. Yeah, it's difficult, but that's what God calls us to do, is to face reality. If you talk to some of these clinical psychologists, they will tell you that if you became addicted to drugs in high school, then when you come off of drugs, even though you may be in your 30s or 40s, you are still a high schooler, because you've been using drugs to try to navigate the difficulties of life. And now you have to go back to when you first, picked up this habit, and you have to work through the difficulties. And they're harder when you're older. Of course they're harder when you get over. But they have to be done. There are no easy ways in life. We all are called sometimes to take the difficult path, but the difficult path is difficult. And it's not easy. And all of us have to go through it. And so just having that interpretation of, take the narrow path, isn't necessarily the easiest interpretation, because all of us are going to have easy and difficult paths in life, and we just simply need to understand that that's the way that life works. I kind of feel like there might be something deeper in this teaching of Jesus. And of course, if you look at what he's saying here, he says, all of you, right? He says, enter through the narrow gates, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. And small is the gate, narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find of it. But what Jesus is talking about, he's talking about all of us. Jesus is talking about this saying to the disciples and to the small crowd. And when he says you, he's not talking about an individual you. He's talking about all of you. In the Greek, it's a plural form of all of you. All of you should enter through the narrow gate. And it's not that only one will find the narrow gate, but it's few will find the narrow gate. And so another way of looking at this is to say, well, maybe what I need to do as I'm going through these difficult paths is to make sure I've got good Christian friends to go through these paths with me. That I'm not on this journey alone, that there are other people that are on this same journey. And the more I surround myself with people of integrity and courage and people who follow Jesus, the easier this journey will be. Because when I fall, They can surround me and they can lift me up and they can pick me up and they can brush me off and they can help me along the journey. And I think this is good. I think this is really, really true. I think we should surround ourselves with people that we can trust during this journey. People who love Jesus, people who are on the same path. They too want to go through the narrow path. And so when either of us falls, we pick each other up and we move forward. Isn't it in Proverbs 27 where it says iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another? These journeys are not meant to go through alone. These journeys are meant to go through with other people. And so if we have other people in our life, they can help us through this journey. And so we should seek them out and we should encourage them to join us on this journey. And as we grow in our faith, they grow in our faith, and we all grow closer to Jesus. And that's what we're supposed to do. I went on a pastor's conference recently, this last week, and was in this pastor's conference, and they had a clinical psychotherapist present a session. And the question that was asked was really good. It's like, how do we know if we as pastors should take care of this ourselves? And how do we know if we as pastors should kind of refer this to somebody who's a quote-unquote professional? And if you're a pastor, this is something we all struggle with because everybody goes through issues. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, is this beyond what I can do, or is this kind of something that I need to refer to somebody else? And what was interesting, like fascinating about this conference was the guy who was teaching it, leading this particular session, deep Christian. He says, don't underestimate the power of pastors. He goes, you as pastors have some tools in your toolkit that we don't have. He said, for example, you have love and grace and forgiveness, and you can hold people accountable to love, grace, and forgiveness. Whereas us in the psychotherapy world, we can't necessarily do that. Because, for example, you might have people that come in to your session, and oftentimes if it's a couple and they're looking to divorce, they've already made the decision that they're going to divorce, and they're coming to you because they just want to help make the decision easier. He says, you as pastors can say, listen, you two came together before God, and you said till death parts us, but out in the world, that doesn't hold anymore. Today, it's, till the difficult things happen, and then that'll part us. And there are a lot of people, when difficulties happen, they come in and they don't necessarily want to work through the difficulties. He says, but a pastor can do that. And so we should seek out, in Christian counseling, we should seek out Christian counselors that are going to help us through these Christian counseling things so that we can do what God wants us to do. Because God does have a plan. He wants us to do that. There are things in the pastor's toolkit that are important that need to be considered if you are a Christian. And so seek out help that's going to help you maintain or help you look at things through a Christian worldview, a Christian lens. Especially, another one he said is grief. He says, as a psychotherapist, we can only go so far when it comes to grief. But Christians, oh my goodness, they can talk about the resurrection. A Christian pastor or a Christian therapist can talk about the resurrection, the hope of the resurrection, all these things that are so helpful during grief that if you don't have that in the toolbox, you can't bring it up. So I thought that was interesting. We're not in this alone. Jesus brings us on this journey with other people because he wants us to grow in our faith, and he wants other people to help us grow in our faith. And so we are not on this journey alone, this journey through the narrow path and through the narrow gate. We have other people with us on the journey, and that, I think, is helpful too. So, right, stay on the narrow path, but understand that sometimes God's going to let you go on the wide path so that you can grow on your faith, but through both paths, make sure that you're journeying with other people that are followers of Jesus that can help you through the journey. But even that seems kind of a difficult interpretation because sometimes we will take the wrong path, and sometimes we will try to go it alone, and sometimes life will get really, really difficult. And if we're truly going to grow, what we really need to make sure is that we just don't get lost through these difficult times. That somebody is holding on to us no matter what path we're going on. And see, I think that's the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount. This is what Jesus said in Matthew 6:33, right? Is seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. The whole point of this sermon is that, yes, there are narrow paths, and yes, there are wide paths, and sometimes you're going to go alone, and sometimes you're going to go with other people. But in all things, seek God first. No matter what path you take, seek God first. Because when you put God first in your life and you seek him first, that's when all of these things come together. And that, I think, my friends, is the whole secret of this little passage, is to understand that God is with you no matter what path you take. That because of his incredible love for you and because he has bought and purchased you with his own precious blood, he's tied this rope onto you. And no matter what path you go, he will never let go of that rope. So even if you go down the wrong path, he'll pull you back out of that path and he'll set you in the right direction. And even if you go down the wrong path, he still has himself tethered to you. And that, my friends, is the greatest joy of all, is to understand that sometimes these paths are difficult and sometimes we're going them alone, but Jesus never lets us go on these paths alone. Even if we feel like we're alone, he is tethered himself to us in all of these roads. And that, my friends, I think is the lesson here. And that is, as you walk down these paths, put Jesus first and put his righteousness first and his love first and his wisdom first. And if we do that on a daily basis, Jesus will always walk with us on this path. And even when we don't do it on a daily basis, Jesus walks with us on this path because he loves you. He's tethered to you and he'll never let you go. He'll never leave or forsake you. The story is told about the Indian brave who was coming into manhood. And one of the tests of manhood for that Indian brave is to go out into the forest, and there's a tree stump. And he has to go on that tree stump, and he has to sit on that tree stump and put on a blindfold and sit there all through the night and listen to all the sounds of the animals and try to live through that fear of being attacked at night, and then in the morning he can take off the blindfold and he can walk back home. And when he does this as a test of manhood, he is no longer, a scout, but now he's a brave. And he can be entered into the community as a full-grown man. And so the story is that these men would go out, these boys would go out, and they would come back men, and they'd sit on the tree stump. But what's not told of these braves is that the elders of the village, oftentimes the brave's father, could be somebody else, would be just out of earshot, watching the whole time to make sure that no harm comes to these young boys. And that's kind of my view of Jesus watching out for us. Sometimes it does seem like we're alone. Sometimes we're here on the path that doesn't seem like the right path, and we're not sure if we're heading in the right direction or not. But Jesus is there, even if we can't see him. If we can't touch him and feel him, he is there because he's attached himself, he's bound himself like a rope to us that he'll never let go. And that, my friends, that is the blessing of this whole thing. I think about this poem of Robert Frost and just spend hours sometimes thinking about the beauty of poetry. What did he mean by this poem? There are a lot of people debate about what Robert Frost meant by this poem, because the last verse, right? He said, two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one that dared me to try, and that has made all the difference. Did he go on the road that was less traveled, or did he go on the road that was more traveled? And the answer is, it's rather ambiguous. It doesn't really say. He went on the road that he went on the road. I mean, he went on the road that he went on the road to. That's the answer. And that has made all the difference. In other words, it sounds as if like Robert Frost paused in his life and considered the roads in front of him and looked at both and then just took one. And that's the road that he took. A lot of people see this as Robert Frost having no regrets at all about life, about the roads that he took. Because sometimes he took the left road, and sometimes he took the right road, and sometimes he took the easy road, and sometimes he took the difficult road, and sometimes he went alone, and sometimes he went with friends. But in all the cases, he made an intentional decision about which road he was going to take. And it was that intentional decision that made the difference. So I would say to us as followers of Jesus, yes, there's narrow roads and there's wide roads, there's easy roads, there's hard roads, there's roads alone, there's roads with other people. But in each road, as we seek Jesus first, stop and pause and consider every once in a while what Jesus wants us to do, which road that he wants us to take. We won't always get it right. Sometimes we will make it wrong. Sometimes it'll go horribly for us. Sometimes it'll go wonderfully for us. But in either case, we're not alone because we have Jesus. In all roads, we have Jesus because he loves and bought us and purchased us, and he never lets us go. Would you join me in prayer? Gracious God, I do thank you for never letting us go. In all the roads of life, Lord, grant us wisdom to take the road that you want us to take and help us to have the courage to do that. And when we fail, Lord, never let go of us. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Amen. Just a few announcements. One is that Trunk or Treat's coming up on August 29th. It's a Saturday. If you want to help out for Trunk or Treat, you can certainly sign up. We have a sign-up genius going out. You could sign up for trunk. You could be a candy runner. There's all sorts of things you can do. Even if you don't even leave your own home, you can pray for the event. So we would love for you to be a part of our Trunk or Treat. It's one of our biggest outreaches to the community. And so I pray that God will lead you into which path you're going to do that. Also, this is part of fall break. And so the church office is closed this week periodically. So make sure you call first before you come in. If you've already got a scheduled event, we'll be there to open up for that event. But if you just pop in unannounced, you may not find everybody there. Wednesday night there is no CLV Wednesday for this Wednesday night because it is the fall break. So other than that, I just pray you have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Go in peace and serve the Lord with joy. Thanks be to God.